Hello and welcome back to the observation deck. I'm glad you've settled in with me today. I want to start by asking you to recall a very specific haunting kind of failure. Not the failure of being distracted, but the failure of being hollow. You've spent the last 2 hours working with the most powerful tools ever created. You've had ChatGPT summarize 5 complex papers you've used. To generate a strategic plan, you've scrolled through a dozen high-signal threads. You feel like a god of information. You feel optimal. But then a colleague asks you a simple fundamental question about the core logic of what you just learned. Or perhaps the power goes out, the screen goes dark, and you are left alone with your thoughts. In that moment, you realize something terrifying. You own nothing. You have the feeling of expertise without a single gram of the substance. You are standing in a magnificent library, but every book you open is blank. I spent the better part of 3 months living inside that specific failure state, convinced that access was the same as acquisition. And from the observation deck, looking down at the hardwired biology of the human animal, I finally realized why your brain was never designed to be a hard drive. It behaves more like a high-efficiency incinerator roan that constantly evaluates what is worth keeping and what is too expensive to maintain. To understand why tools like ChatGPT can begin to downregulate your biological intelligence, we have to look at the accounting system of the human mind. In the world of tech, we talk about potential, but in the world of biology, everything is governed by cost. Your brain is a massive energy hog. It represents only 2 of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 20 of your total daily calories. Every long-term memory you form, every complex structure you build in your mind is not just abstract, it is physical. It requires protein synthesis. It requires structural change. It is a real metabolic investment, and your brain is extremely selective about when that investment is justified. For hundreds of millions of years, survival didn't reward total recall, it rewarded efficient filtering. The organisms that thrived weren't the ones who remembered everything, but the ones who retained only what proved repeatedly useful. Forgetting in that sense isn't a flaw. It's an optimization strategy. Unmoans, your brain defaults to a process we can think of as the purge. Every night as you sleep, your system evaluates recent inputs. Was this information used? Will it likely be needed again? If the answer is uncertain, the system reclaims the energy. This is why you forget most of what you read, not because your brain is broken, but because it is operating exactly as designed. Now introduce a variable that this system never evolved to handle: the presence of effectively zero-cost retrieval. With the rise of large language models, we've externalized one of the most metabolically expensive processes we have, the effort required to synthesize meaning. On the surface, this feels like augmentation. But to your brain's internal accounting system, it sends a very specific signal: the cost of retrieving this information has collapsed. And the brain doesn't just store information based on importance, it stores it based on the expected cost of needing it again. If something can be accessed instantly, reliably, and without effort, the system begins to treat it as externalized. Not because it's useless, but because it's no longer worth storing internally. From the brain's perspective, that's just efficient. This is where the AI trap begins to take shape. Each time you outsource the initial struggle, summarizing instead of parsing, generating instead of constructing, you reduce the need for internal retrieval. And over time, reduced retrieval leads to weaker reinforcement. Weaker reinforcement leads to fragile pathways. Eventually, those pathways begin to degrade, not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually through disuse. The system isn't failing. It's adapting to the signals you're giving it. You're not just using a tool. You're training a system. And the danger isn't just that the AI might be wrong. The more subtle danger is that it can be so clean, so fluent, that it bypasses the very mechanisms required for learning. This leads us into what I call the mirage of recognition. I imagine using AI to compress a dense, complex book into 5 elegant bullet points. They are clear. They are logically sound. As you read them, you feel a sense of familiarity, a quiet confidence that you understand. But what you're experiencing isn't learning. It's processing fluency. Your brain recognizes the pattern, and recognition is a low-cost signal. It tells the system, this is known, this is safe, no need to allocate further resources. But recognition and recall are not the same. Recognition says, I've seen this before. Recall says, I can reconstruct this from nothing. And only one of those requires structural change. When information is too smooth, too easily digestible, it never triggers the deeper encoding process. It feels like knowledge, but it never becomes one. And this dynamic doesn't stop at language. As generative models expand into visual domains, we begin outsourcing another core function, internal simulation. Human intelligence depends heavily on the ability to build mental models, imagine, manipulate, and test scenarios internally. But when external systems can render those models instantly in high fidelity, the incentive to maintain that internal capacity weakens. Why construct a detailed mental representation when it can be generated on demand? This is the deeper layer of the trap. It's not just about information. It's about agency. Over time, we risk shifting from active constructors of understanding to passive consumers of output. We trade what we might call neural sovereignty for computational convenience. So if the system is driven by minimizing cost, the only viable counter-strategy is to deliberately reintroduce it. We need friction, not as a punishment, but as a signal. From a biological perspective, there is no such thing as studying. There is only proving utility. You have to demonstrate through effort that a piece of information is worth the investment. This is why passive consumption fails. It never sends a strong enough signal. Instead, I practice something I call hostile interrogation. Before allowing any summary human or AU, stop. And you close your eyes. You attempt to reconstruct the idea from zero. You force your mind to reach, to search, to struggle. And when you feel that resistance, that cognitive friction, that is the moment the system pays attention. That's when the brain detects a gap between what is needed and what is available and begins allocating resources to close it. Struggle isn't a byproduct of learning. It is the mechanism. If it feels easy, if you're simply nodding along to a perfectly structured explanation, you are not building anything. You are observing, and observation alone doesn't change the system. To make this sustainable, you also need to work with the brain's natural tendency to forget. And plus, this is where strategic forgetfulness comes in. Instead of forcing mastery in one sitting, you allow partial decay. You let the signal weaken, and then you actively retrieve it again. Each retrieval reinforces the pathway, not just the content. Over time, the system learns. This information keeps coming back. It must matter. And then, there is the final test, the lights out test. If the system went dark right now, no internet, no external support, what could you actually explain? Not recognize. Not search. Explain. If the answer is very little, then very little has been integrated. You don't possess the knowledge. You possess access to it. And in a world where access is universal, possession is what differentiates. From the observation deck, the conclusion is simple: information is not naturally retained. It is continuously evaluated, and unless it proves its worth, it is discarded. To keep it, you have to make forgetting more expensive than remembering. So the next time you sit down to work, resist the instinct to smooth everything out. Don't optimize for speed. Don't optimize for comfort. Introduce resistance. Close the loop yourself before outsourcing it. Build before you borrow. Because the expertise you feel when you skim your saved outputs, that's not ownership. That's familiarity. It's a ghost. But the ideas you struggle to reconstruct, the ones you have to fight for, piece by piece, Those are different. Those are embedded. Those are yours. Stop highlighting. Start reconstructing. Stop recognizing. Start retrieving. The information isn't gone. It's waiting for a signal that it matters. I'm glad you joined me on the observation deck today. We're here to examine the machinery, not to escape it, but to learn how to work with it. I'll see you in the next one.